Muhammad, but then it wasn't compiled at his time. So according to Jacob Neusner, who's a Jewish scholar,
Yes, I have a couple of his books.
he's actually one of the most prolific writers of all time.
8 billion books.
I think he's written 900 and something. He's got the record for the most books written by a human being, I think.
Yes, I have one of his books on Midrash.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about.
Right.
So that one there,
It's
yeah.
many that you're talking about. But
Genesis, the plausibility that Genesis Rabbah would have been available in the Arabian Peninsula.
No, zero. But,
Yeah.
The fact is that Jews at the time also would not have acknowledged that, unless it was common knowledge, that pharaohs thought of themselves as God. So Ramses wasn't the only pharaoh to think of himself as God. Certainly later pharaohs, all the way up to the Ptolemaic times. So the idea that pharaohs thought of themselves as divine beings, as did many ancient kings in the ancient Near East, might have been common knowledge. I don't find it that surprising that Genesis Rabbah or Muhammad or any other person.
Yeah, but it's a cumulative case. So we're saying, because he started off by saying...
Yeah, but I guess that, right, so that particular instance doesn't seem like a particularly compelling instance.
No, but it's an interesting one, isn't it? So if you add that, is it accurate or inaccurate? For example, it could be falsified. Yeah, because if you say that, okay, well, we're looking for aspects which are falsifiable. So for example, if the Quran had made the point or the claim that they didn't claim divinity, then we can disprove it. You see the point? So there's one. We said number one, Pharaoh. Number two, it says in the Quran, فَالْيَوْمْ نُنَجِّيكَ بِبَدَنِكَ لِتَكُونَ لِمَنْ خَلْفَكَ آيَةً. Yeah, in chapter 10 of the Quran, Surah Yunus, it says that we will preserve your body so that you can be for those who come after you as a reminder. So the Quran is making a claim. Assalamu alaikum, how are you doing? You okay? MashaAllah, you're right, good to see you. Assalamu alaikum, how are you, brother? You okay? Good to see you, MashaAllah, you're right. How are you? Shake your hand again. How are you, Akhi? You okay? Good to see you, right? So it says that today we will preserve your body so you can be a sign, an evidence, a piece of evidence for those who come after you. Bro, Ramses II, at the time of Anwar Sadat, who was the president of Egypt at the time, who was famous for the Camp David Agreement and the settlement and the peace treaty that he done with Israel, he brought the body of Ramses II into Egypt, and he did so with red carpet treatment, because he said that it's a bit ridiculous considering he's a Muslim and this guy's meant to be like the main antagonist in the Quran. But the point is, he brought him in, and his body is there in Egypt right now. You can Google his image. You can see what Ramses II looks like. Ramses II, body has been preserved. The Quran states that, so this is a prediction of what's going to happen in the future. You can say, okay, well, we don't believe in this and that, but we say this is a prediction of the future now. It's getting more and more interesting.
So just regarding the claims about Solomon, so I think it's a fairly substantial point against the Quran if the stories about around the time described much less grand magical activities regarding at the time. A thing that we know is that stories don't tend to that will pass from word of mouth don't tend to underrate the exciting bits involving magic and so on.
Yeah, but the Jewish Kabbalah and the Kabbalah and all that stuff, where do you think it comes from? They believe that they got the magic from under the Temple of Solomon.
Okay, but that's not what they talk about in Kings and Chronicles. There's no description of them being engaged.
Nevertheless, that's not the entirety of the corpus of the Jews. So the idea of magic is clear. There's tracts written. I think Maimonides wrote a book on magic. There's at the end of the So and they all bring it back to Solomon's era and the temple. So it's this idea that.
Here, what you're saying is perfectly compatible with the account I'm giving. So here's the account I'm giving. Basically, David and Solomon were fairly ordinary kings. Then, over time, the stories grew wilder and wilder until they were claimed to be that magic was running rampant in their time.
Sure.
Then this got later attributed by people around the time of Maimonides to David and Solomon. And in addition, this influenced the views of Muhammad, which he then wrote down.
Maimonides came after Muhammad.
That's perfectly compatible with what I said.
Did you just say that Maimonides then Muhammad was influenced? That's what you just said.
I may have. I didn't know the ordering, but the ordering doesn't matter for my point.
But there's a good 1,000 years or something, or 800 years between the two people. So I don't know how someone 800 years later can be influenced by someone that came by 800 years before him.
I wasn't saying Muhammad was influenced by Maimonides.
So what then?
what I was saying was that the stories grew wilder over time, and these wilder stories were responsible for what both Muhammad and Maimonides wrote down.
Okay. Well, as I said, there's a I don't know how many years difference between Prophet Muhammad, who died 631, and Maimonides, who was in the 12th century or something. Yeah, Salah al-Ayyubi, right? So 12th century or something.
Yes.
It doesn't matter when they wrote.
So it's like a good 700 years apart, right? But
Influenced by Avicenna and Averroes.
who was?
Maimonides.
Exactly right. So he was clearly influenced by the Muslims. I mean, Maimonides, where he wrote the book, The Guide to the Perplexed, which is Dala al-Ha'irin, where if you look at how much more so, I think Ibn Rushd actually, Averroes, than Ibn Sina, which
Cites them explicitly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the idea that Maimonides, I think he's aside the point. If anything, he's been influenced more by Islam than the opposite. I mean, most of his ideas are Islamic. If you look at his book, Islamic philosophers and thinkers.
Well, Aristotelian.
Yeah, true. But through Ibn Rushd.
Islam drew on
True.
Islamic philosophers drew on Aristotle.
Yeah.
As did.
Agreed.
As
Agreed.
did Thomas
So
Aquinas.
he got a lot of it from Ibn Rushd. I mean, Thomas Aquinas' third way, for example, is
Yes.
Avicenna's Burhan.
The basic point
He was late
is
to the party.
what we
Yeah.
would expect on the hypothesis that the Quran was not directly dictated by God is we would expect that the stories that would go into the Quran would resemble much more the circulating Arabic legends of the time than they would resemble what the earliest sources say about the subject. Because otherwise you have to think that, strangely, as the tales grew wilder over time, they got more accurate, which never happens.
Sure. But
and
so there is no evidence on. Usually, people who make the argument of the circulating Arabic tales, they do so vis-a-vis, for example, Alexander legends and so on, with chapter 18 of the Quran, Surah Al-Kahf. They don't do so with this point because there wasn't really any circulating Arab legends on this front. Don't forget also that.
I think we do have.
But
I think we do have examples of. I mean, we certainly have examples of legends about David and Solomon that grew wilder in the later period. In later periods.
But you must acknowledge the following. Your main argument was this. You're saying that the Quran mentioning that there's some kind of magical activity happening at the time of Solomon is somehow undermining of the Quranic narrative. Now, I'm saying point number one, this would be considered to be an argument from silence in historical terms. And even if you do make this argument, you need to understand, especially with David and Solomon, as I mentioned before, people like Israel Finkelstein, who have retracted their positions in a span of 20 years after steles like the Tel Dan stele has been found, should be enough evidence for you to realize that you shouldn't be quick to make a judgment, especially as a non-historian, because you have historians making these judgments and then retracted them 20 years, especially vis-a-vis David and Solomon. But then what we can analyze is that which can be falsified regarding the historical record, regarding David and Solomon, and regarding Moses. As I've mentioned, what already has been mentioned in the Quran relating to Moses, the fact that Pharaoh had claimed to be God, the fact that there were other gods that were being worshipped at the time of Pharaoh, and the fact that Pharaoh's body will be preserved. These are just three examples. And there are so many other examples like this. Haman, the mentioning of this Haman, a person called Haman, obviously Maurice Bucquoy wrote an entire book on it, the French historian and scientist. He wrote a whole book on the Egypt, and I think he called the Egypt in the Quran or something like that. But the point is, in that book, he says that these names, he went and found in primary source information that these names of the people at the time of Pharaoh were the very names that were actually there at the time of Pharaoh, at the time of Ramses II. So you have very specific information. And then you add to that, which everyone knows this classic one, the fact that, for example, in the book of Genesis, you have the story of Joseph. And in chapter 12 of the Quran, Surah Joseph, the Surah of Joseph, you have the same story. And bear in mind, Joseph is located also in Egypt. But then you find that when Joseph in the Quran is discussing with the sovereign of Egypt at the time, he was referring to him as a king. Whereas Moses was referring to the sovereign of that time as a pharaoh. And now it has essentially been confirmed that the Bible was wrong and the Quran was right. So this is a clear-cut case of the Quran actually historically correcting the Bible on something which in the...
But I'm sorry, make the argument again?
Let me make the argument.
Yeah.
So in the book of Genesis,
Yes.
you have the discussion of Joseph.
Yes.
Okay, Joseph. And in the Quran, you also have Joseph being mentioned. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, if you look at most historians, whether they be Christian, Muslim, or otherwise, they locate Joseph, at the time of the Upper Intermediate period. This is the Hiscox dynasty. The Hiscox dynasty was not a dynasty of pharaohs; it was a dynasty of kings. And so the Quran depicts Joseph as having an interaction with what he calls to be a king of the sovereign of Egypt at that time, whereas the Bible in the book of Genesis calls him Pharaoh. So the question is if...
Even the...
Yeah.
I mean, look, I was just in the British Museum.
Sure.
So even the leaders at that time, I mean, first of all, the Hyksos came and went. So it's not clear exactly if the Israelites at the time were identified with the Hyksos. But there were pharaohs going all the way back to the first dynasty who used the term pharaoh. So in there was actually a couple pharaohs during that time, and I can't remember the names, but there's a part of the exhibit on Egyptology at the British Museum talking about pharaohs that are not in the list of pharaohs. I mean, the pharaohs would often say, I'm so-and-so, here's all my predecessors that were named pharaohs. There were pharaohs that they found during that period who were pharaohs but were not in the list. But they found their sarcophagi and so on. But I don't have any reason to think that the leaders of Egypt at the time of the Hyksos did not also call themselves.
Yeah, so I've looked into this myself in secondary source material, and I think it's almost a matter of consensus.
Okay.
So this point here is almost a matter of consensus that at that time of Joseph, which is meant to be situated, and they use it through genealogies and stuff like that, that was in the Hyksos period, and at that time it was a king and not a pharaoh. So the point I'm making is, look, think of the following. Anyway, we all agree that the Hyksos dynasty, they had kings. The fact that the Quran's even mentioning the word king here, where it's deviating from the norm, because the norm is pharaoh. Like every single time Moses speaks to the sovereign of Egypt, he says pharaoh, Pharaoh in Arabic. It's the Arabized version of the word pharaoh, or the Hebrew equivalent. But what I'm saying is, why is it Joseph is saying Melik? He's speaking to the king. It's a different word, and it's the same location, geographic location. It indicates a very precise, sophisticated knowledge that could not, I mean, it's very implausible. Once again, it's a cumulative case. When you add all these things together, when you add the things I've just mentioned together, the fact that we all accept now the Rosetta Stone was, discovered in the 1800s and this information couldn't have been known, the historical argument for the veracity of Islam. I mean, let's be honest, it's pretty impressive. I mean, the Bible itself has no equivalent to this.
Well, certainly the Greeks and the Persians knew something about the divinity of pharaohs, the pharaoh's claims of divinity. And that was common knowledge, even without, deciphering.
What Greeks? Which ones?
Pardon?
What Greeks? Which ones? Other Greeks? Which?
I don't know offhand, but certainly there was Greek.
Yeah. Well, the Greek translation, the Greek translation project took place in 300 AH, which is 300 years after the Prophet's death. But there was no Greek texts that were translated into Arabic at that time. In fact, the Arabs didn't even have, until the Abbasid period, the golden age of Islam, any access to this, the Greek texts and so on. So it's a...
Oh, I see. You're talking about the Arab one.
Yeah, because if the point is that they got this from the Greeks.
My point is that, okay, I
do you see what I mean?
Your point, but it may be that it was just common knowledge in the ancient world that pharaohs...
Oh, but the ancient world was not one monolithic entity.
No, but most ancient kings thought of themselves as gods.
I don't know. I think that's a subject of dispute.
I know that.
Yeah, fine. But when we put all of these things together, if I were to ask the simple question, was the Quran accurate or inaccurate in depicting...
Right.
Yeah, so, and then we go through all the things that we just said. Was it accurate or inaccurate in depicting that Pharaoh was going to be preserved? Is it accurate or inaccurate? You have so many accuracies that could have otherwise been... So these accuracies could have otherwise been inaccurate.
But I think...
And then you have no inaccuracies as well.
Well, I would dispute you on no.
Okay, well, you have to find one. Yeah, you can't just disagree. You have to find one.
So, for instance, I think the passage about the sun setting in muddy spring.
Okay. Yeah, so he says that when Dhul Qarnayn وجدها تغرب في عين حمئة, he saw it going into a muddy spring. It doesn't say that he believes that the sun goes into a muddy spring. The Quran says وَكُلٌّ فِي فَلَكٍ يَسْبَحُونَ in chapter number 36, number 40. It says that, it talks about the sun. Some scholars even say it talks about the earth as well, because it says that it starts by وَآيَةٌ لَهُمُ الْأَرْضُ الْمَيْتَةُ أَحْيَيْنَاهَا وَأَخْرَجْنَا مِنْهَا حَبًّا وَمِنْهَا تَخْرُجُونَ, and so on and so forth. And then it goes وَالشَّمْسُ تَجْرِي لِمُسْتَقَرٍّ لَهَا ذَلِكَ تَقْدِيرُ الْعَزِيزِ الْعَلِيمِ لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون. Right? So the Quran mentions, starts by talking about the earth, then it talks about the sun, and then it talks about the moon. Chapter number 36, verse number 40. And it says that they're all revolving around in a motion, in an orbit with their own motion. Ibn Abbas, who is considered to be the most authoritative companion of the Prophet and someone who interpreted these verses, he brought a spinning wheel to demonstrate what the Quran actually meant by this. That's why the scholars of Islam, even pre-modernity, for example, At-Tabari and Ibn Kathir and others, they looked at the verse just for the lay person who doesn't understand the verse in chapter number 18, verse number 86, where it talks about, وَجَدَهَا تَقْرُبُ فِي عَيْنٍ حَمِئَةٍ, that Dhul Qarnayn saw the sun going into the muddy spring. And they say that this is not saying that the sun, they say this is not saying the sun does that, because we know that the sun has its own orbits and so on and so forth. So we have classical scholars that go back and say all of these things. In fact, there's no verse in the Quran which indicates something against what we know. Comparative to the Bible, look at the Bible. The only verse in the Bible, according to John Walton, a Christian scholar in America, based in America, he says there's only one verse in the Bible which indicates that the earth may be round. And that's in the book of Isaiah, chapter number 40, verse number 22, where it's mentioned the circle of the earth. The circle of the earth. But even he said that when you have the circle of the earth and it's flat, it's depicted as flat, it's a disc.
It's a different kind of.
So there's nothing in the Bible, there is no explanation, even on the rotundity of the earth. There is no explanation, unless you want to metaphorize, as the Christians have been doing now, because they have been found out with the Genesis narrative. And there is no equivalent to Genesis chapter 1, verse number 1 to 20, where it talks about the sun being created on the third day.
And Genesis, I believe, is it that the metaphorical one? Or is it
no, they say it's metaphoric, but the only person in the ancient period who said that was Origen of Alexandria, who's considered to be an ecumenical church council writer. He's not even considered to be a saint. Him and his Jewish teacher Philo in the Alexandrian school. But the majority, for example, if you consider the other church fathers, they actually consider this all to be 100% literal. In fact, in fact, Augustine himself wrote on the literal interpretation. This is a book that he wrote on the literal interpretation of Genesis.
But then there would be a lot more problems that way.
Of course there'll be problems. But there's problems either way, because even if it's not, even if you don't want to talk about it being a thing, the book of Genesis says that there's night and day on the first day, but then there's on the third day, the fourth day, the sun was created. I want to know how there was a night and day without the sun. And on the third day, vegetation was there. But then on Genesis chapter 2, verse number 5, it says no plant has sprung up yet. So is there plants or no plants? So much so that William...
No plant has sprung up because there hadn't been rain yet. So there was, I'm not defending it. But the argument is the plants were in the ground but hadn't sprouted yet, because there were no...
But you got on the third day, you got all the shrubberies and all the trees, everything is there. I mean, no photosynthesis because the sun wasn't there on the fourth day. So it looks like, as William Craig said, I mean, this is what Craig said. He said the following. He said that it looks like honestly, this is, you can Google this. He says that it looks like the author of the Bible did not care if there's contradictions inside of it.
Damn.
This is William Craig.
William Craig himself.
So what I'm trying to say to you is...
So it talks about the setting point. It doesn't just say he saw like the reflection in a spring. It says he found the setting point of the sun. Like, there's not a specific point where the sun sets.
Yeah, all right. So as I mentioned, the Quran mentions in chapter number 39, verse number 5, يُكَوِّرُ اللَّيْلُ عَلَى النَّهَارِ وَيُكَوِّرُ النَّهَارَ عَلى اللَّيْلِ وَسَخَّرَ الشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ كُلٌّ يَجْرِي لِأَجَلٍ مُسَمَّى. In chapter number 39, which is Surah Zumar, where Allah mentions that He rolls the day into the night, and He rolls the night into the day, and He creates the day, وَسَخَّرَ الشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ, and He made subordinate the sun and the moon. كُلٌّ يَجْرِي لِأَجَلٍ مُسَمَّى. All of them are going to an appointed time. Now, Ibn Hazm, who is a...
that they're all going to an appointed time doesn't...
No, but let me tell you what he said. Ibn Hazm, who's in the 4th century scholar, 400 years after the Prophet. Classical interpretation of this verse, he says this indicates the earth is round. In his book Al-Fisal.
Why does it?
He says because there's no way, the word yukawiru comes from the word kura, which means ball. And you cannot have this motion, he says it's impossible, you cannot have this motion unless you have a ball. That's what he says. Now someone could say, well, that's you're doing apologetics. Yeah. It doesn't look like Ibn Hazm, who lived in 400 years after the Prophet ﷺ died, has any modern reason to try and say that the earth is round. Whereas in the Bible it says that the earth is flat. And there's no interpretation of a classical nature or type that indicates that the earth is round from a literal reading of the Bible. So if you believe the earth is round, and you also believe in literally interpreting the Quran and the Bible, you have to believe in the Quran. You cannot believe in the Bible. Finish. No way.
Well, yeah. I have more things to say. I think I should probably get going, but it was nice
no
meeting
problem.
you.
Thank you very much, brother.
Yeah, thank you. Have a nice day.
It's true though, isn't it? You're a very intelligent man. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Should we go now?
I just sat here because my back was hurting so bad.